First speaker is Dr. Greg Moore. Greg, I think it's fair enough to describe him as a Melbourne tree legend. And in 2017, he was awarded an OAM for services to the environment. Greg has also been a major speaker at conferences in Australia and overseas. Please welcome Greg Moore.
So the first thing I wanted to sort of mention is that, do you have an urban forest and are we looking after one? Because the term forest actually means you've got to have 30% canopy cover. That's the definition that's been used in Australia for years. Most of the councils that we deal with don't have an urban forest because the canopy cover is nowhere near 30%. So what do they have? We all know what we mean by an urban forest, but maybe we should be a bit more realistic and say we've got an urban woodland. Because if you call it an urban forest, people will assume you've got one and you don't have to work to keep what you've got or to expand what you haven't got. You know, language matters, and I think these things have to be sort of thought through. Those of you that were here last time will know that I asked a question, was 30% an arboricultural magic number? Well, these days I just come out and say yes, it is. 30% is an arboricultural magic number. It's what a forest is, it's where you get most benefits from a tree canopy cover. If you have more canopy cover, you get more benefit, but the fact is you work really hard for not much extra. So you should be aiming for about 30% canopy cover. And for those of you that want to appeal to the economic rationalists in the community, up until 30% the property value goes up, you get to 30% and then it starts to fall. And what that tells you is that Australians want canopy on their properties, they just don't want too much of it, which suggests to me that they're reasonably sensible about this. So you want to remember that. And this one is the 3-30-300 rule. The 3 says a person should have the right to see 3 trees from their home, should live where there's 30% canopy cover, and they should be within 300 metres of a green space, and I say a treed green space. Is it a rule? No. Is there some data to support it? Yes. And when you go from here, last time I asked you to remember 30%, this time I'm going to ask you to up the ante and remember 3-30-300. So that when someone says, what should we be doing about planning? You'll be able to answer 3-30-300. Now the other thing I wanted to point out is that the lifespans of trees in cities are pretty short. The closer you get to the CBD or you get to a major shopping hub, the shorter the lifespan of the trees. This is really sort of a significant issue because if we want to get the best out of our trees, we want them living for 50 to 100 years. 150, 200 even better, but we want to get the most we can out of them. And those of you in this audience know that there are major tree losses in the first 2 to 4 years when a tree is first planted. And quite often they're from sort of things that we can't entirely control. It might be pests, it might be vandalism, it might be droughts, those sorts of things. But there's another significant spike in tree deaths after about 30 years. And that 30 years is almost always due to human activity, i.e. digging through their roots, development, removals and so on. It's something that we can control. Longer lifespans can be achieved. So in Berlin, for example, all the trees were removed by the end of the Second World War. And if you go to Berlin now, there's lots and lots of trees. They're even aged, they're over 70 years, and they're doing well, okay? And they really preserve and protect them because they know what it was like when there weren't any significant trees. We haven't reached that stage yet. Have you thought about how much carbon and resources have been spent on getting that tree into the ground? It can take between 25 and 30 years before a tree becomes carbon positive. Now we all know that we want these trees to be sequestering carbon, but have you ever thought, well, we've planted that tree, it was grown in nursery, it's been put on a truck, there's a digger to dig a hole, all those sorts of things. And so lots and lots of energy and other resources, including carbon, have been utilised in getting that tree into that position. So if it dies in the first couple of years or after 30 years, that is an absolute tragedy. You need those trees to live longer. And if we don't do that, then these tree deaths are simply unsustainable environmentally and ludicrously uneconomical. We've put all the resources into them, they haven't lasted, we've got none of the benefit. That's a lose, lose, lose big time. Now with urban trees, have you thought about how hard it is to actually define what you want in a good urban tree? We expect a lot of our urban trees. What do you want the tree to do? Firstly, You want them to be very tolerant of stresses, of environmental and climatic conditions, of different soil types, of a restricted urban space. We want them to establish and grow quickly. We want them tall but not too tall, straight and single trunk, tolerant of stresses, pest, disease, pollution and pruning, neat and tidy with soil surfaces and infrastructure unaltered by tree roots, free of shedding of flowers, fruits, foliage and bark, and maintenance free. We don't ask much, do we? Now you all know what that is. That's a post. We demand all of these things from our street trees and from our urban trees, and then when they have the indecency to drop a few leaves, put a bit of a mess on the footpath, we don't think of getting a broom and a rake, we think of getting the chainsaw and getting rid of the damn thing. It's completely unrealistic. Now Adelaide is in some ways the canary in the coal mine for climate change. The South Australian Parliament reviewed tree losses a couple of years ago. They were worried about temperatures exceeding 50 degrees in the city of Adelaide, which makes a city almost unlivable. They're worried because air conditioners don't work, they're not rated to work all that well after 45. They'd already lost 11% of their canopy cover in a decade, and they were losing 75,000 trees per year. You and I know that the situation for Melbourne and for Victoria as a whole is much worse than that. And so they decided they had to do something about it. They've taken it seriously. Our government, like that of Western Australia for example, sleepwalking into climate change. They don't know what's going to hit them until it hits. My worry is with all of the canopy losses around our cities, and I don't just mean Melbourne, you can go to Benalla or Euroa and the citizens there are fighting to preserve trees. How bloody bizarre is that? Now, if we don't get this right, at some stage there will be an Ash Wednesday-like heat wave, and I expect somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people to die. I don't think I'm being catastrophic or exaggerating in my concern. You think that you've got an urban forest and you think it's evenly distributed amongst our citizens. Well, you know it's not. You know that to the north and the west there are far fewer trees. The urban heat island effect is much more significant. This has an impact on the health of the locals, their lifespans, the quality of lives they lead, and of course the development and educational outcomes for their children. These are matters that are really matters of life and death for these sorts of people, and they have a huge impact on the way people live in those suburbs. So we know that the most impoverished parts of cities have the lowest canopy cover, the highest urban heat island effect. Now the paradox in this is obvious. The sectors of society that most need canopy cover and green space are those that have least of it and the least access to it. That is bizarre. How can that be seen as equitable in a society like those that we have in Victoria and across Melbourne? So I just wanted to put up major studies on the effects of greenness on women's health in North America, and you'll see here lower heatwave mortalities, longer lifespans, higher birth weights of babies, better educational outcomes for the women's children. You can see that if they go to hospital there for a shorter time, they use fewer prescription drugs. So these health benefits are enormous. And yet here we have the recurring theme of local government areas and local governments trying to maintain a canopy cover, and on private space, front and backyards, trees disappearing at an enormous rate. And governments that had reasonable canopy cover, over 30%, are now finding that they can't maintain that cover because of state government planning allowances that see a very, very dense development and the loss of canopy. So I just wanted to finish on this particular matter. Tree clearing for power lines. How the hell did Victoria become the worst in Australia in that regard? So there's a campaign on this. There was a recommendation to change the canopy cover from a metre to 300 millimetres around trees, which would have transformed the Melbourne landscape, the rural landscape. And what did the state government do on the advice of Energy Safe Victoria? They rejected it, even though there was a unanimous recommendation. First time it ever happened. And of course, the first time that happened, Energy Safe Victoria said, oh geez, these people are talking as one. We can't have that. We better not let that one get out into the public. Well, it is out in the public. And what we were recommending was a 300 millimetre clearance space around low voltage wires in low bushfire risk areas. What's the risk of a bushfire in a low bushfire risk area from low voltage electricity? Zero. None. How do we know that? They've been doing it that way in South Australia for over a decade. No bushfires, no more increases in outages. So it should have been adopted here, and this government did not do it. And it didn't do it, it says, for safety reasons. So here's the rub. It's putting arborists at risk. They're unnecessarily having to go up in those trees to prune those power lines for no good reason. If one of those arborists is hurt or killed, you'll hear plenty from me about it. And finally, don't you realise the benefits we could gain? A massive increase in canopy cover, $1 billion of extra benefits from canopy just from changing the line clearing regulations. They are no longer fit for purpose. Our government has missed a wonderful opportunity here, and I consider them to be negligent in not taking this step that is logical and sensible for the people of Victoria. Thank you all.
Our next speaker is Dr. Judy Bush. Judy is a senior lecturer in urban planning at the University of Melbourne. Her research and teaching focus is on urban environmental policy and governance. Her current research directions are cultural and sustainable landscapes and future cities. Please welcome Judy Bush.
And thanks for the return invitation to come and talk to you all again. I am talking about policy. Can policy protect urban trees? Well, I'm going to take a step back and look at the big picture. I'm talking about policy approaches. I'm taking a metro-wide approach. The key areas where trees are protected within policy for metro areas are across these policy domains. So urban forest, local laws, significant tree registers and planning scheme provisions. And already this evening you've heard a little bit about each of them. Urban forest strategies are probably more of a planning tool than a protection tool. Local laws can apply to public or private land, and they may include assessment decisions and decision criteria, but they're often differently constructed depending on which municipality you're in. Significant tree register, well, we heard about the Boroondara significant tree register. Many councils in the metro area have significant tree registers, but actually, again, they're applied and calculated differently. So some are based on tree circumference. Some of them recognise tree value based on their scientific, social, historic or aesthetic properties. So they can be different in different municipalities. And then I also wanted to talk about planning scheme provisions, which are usually regulatory. Out of the 31 metro councils, you can see a range of different applications of these different policy types for protecting trees. Let's have a look in more detail at the planning scheme provisions, because you can see that 31 out of 31 councils have planning scheme provisions, but approaches really differ. This is an overview of Victorian planning schemes and the sort of content or structure of Victorian planning schemes. Each municipality has its own planning scheme, but those planning schemes include both statewide and regional and local provisions. And they're all arranged in the same way, but many of them have provisions that are specific to the local area. Let's have a look in a bit more detail at the overlays. There are three main types of environmental overlays. If you can see this image, you can see that the overlays are applied in really different ways across the different councils. The municipality next to Boroondara has a lot more of that environmental significance overlay and vegetation protection overlay compared to Boroondara. Boroondara achieves its objectives in other ways. So It makes it hard when you're advocating for tree protections across the metro area because there's not standardisation of approach. That's the overlays. Planning scheme provisions. So the provisions might specify all these things that I've listed on the screen. So they might specify retaining significant trees or vegetation. They might specify inclusion of space for tree planting, maximum proportion of the land occupied by built surfaces, and limitation on impervious surfaces. But there are a whole range of challenges and limitations in our planning schemes. And then there will be amendments that will absolutely change all those rules. So there have been recent amendments related to multi-unit development and apartment development, activity centres, triggered in part by a focus on addressing the housing crisis. We can see that they include the possibility of taking out mature trees, which none of us want to see. Some of the other limitations are that they are, of course, only triggered by a development application. So they won't necessarily apply to removal of trees if they're in someone's backyard or front yard that doesn't require a planning permit. Of course, any planning rules requires enforcement, and that requires the municipality to actually invest in enforcement officers. There's also a difference in the planning scheme between mandatory, discretionary and voluntary. I also wanted to talk about policy integration because I think that's another important area for all of us to think about and an important area for local governments to consider as well. I had an honours student last year who looked at the intersection of urban forest, active transport and health and wellbeing planning. The impetus for this is we have urban forest planning that says we're going to plant an extra 3,000 trees in the municipality, for example. We then also have a completely separate active transport policy that might be in a completely separate bit of council that says we're going to increase our active transport networks, active transport being walking and cycling. Now, we know that during summer, if you want to get out there and walk somewhere or ride somewhere, then tree canopy is going to be potentially life-saving. So, are we aligning our planning for urban forest with our planning for active transport? What Crystal found was, no. So she looked only at City of Melbourne. City of Melbourne are doing a lot of work in both these areas, but there's definitely work that can be done. Recent article in The Age. The tree in Nicholas's front yard has cost him thousands, but council won't let him cut it down. And a quote that I've pulled out from this article. People often believe it's a good idea to have that local law, but then believe it shouldn't apply to them. I was shocked and horrified to read in The Age today that the state government doesn't believe their canopy cover targets apply to them either, because they've just cut down 34 mature trees in Albert Park to make way for more Grand Prix infrastructure. So these are the challenges we're all facing. To conclude, I would say that the important thing is that we need to think about combining all those different types of policy mechanisms. It's not good enough just to rely on one. We need a suite of policy mechanisms, and we need to set and enforce those minimum standards, including 330, 300. We need to encourage and incentivise stewardship, and we need to actually have metro-wide controls and policy consistency so that we're not confused about which municipality are we, which planning scheme, provisions and so on. So my final slide that I probably don't have time to talk about, but just to reinforce that policy success needs to bring together a whole range of different factors. And those factors include things like leaders and champions, goals and targets, also positive narratives, community engagement, policy integration and so on. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.